the jury.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Claire Davis.
Why are you here today, Dr. Davis?
Well, I was contacted by the City of Truman Midlands to conduct a post-election audit of the 2015 mayoral election.
What exactly were you examining in this audit you conducted?
Well, I examined a number of things, including whether or not there was fraud present at the time of the election, and then whether or not that fraud had an impact on the outcome of the election.
We'll get to that audit in just a second, but first, could you tell us a little about your education?
Certainly. I received my bachelor's in political science before going on to earn my JD from Wake Forest. I then went on to pursue my PhD in quantitative methods from the University of Kentucky.
What professional experience do you have?
Well, I'm currently a professor at the University of Georgia School of Law. There, my focus is election law, and more specifically, election fraud.
You mentioned your focus is election fraud. Have you ever been published in this area?
I have, yes. I've published 8 books and 2 textbooks, as well as over 30 articles in academic journals on the subject.
Dr. Davis, in today's case, was this the first audit that you've ever conducted?
It wasn't. This was the 3rd audit that I've conducted.
Were you paid for your work?
I was, yes. I was paid $20,000 by the City of Truman, but I should be clear that money, it didn't come from either candidate, either Ms. Ginger or Mayor Heisman.
I want to move on to the audit itself now. What facts and data did you rely upon using in this audit?
Well, I relied on a number of interviews, almost 400 with citizens of Bellevue, in addition to city officials, and then a number of documents that were obtained by the audit, including polling numbers by a firm called N5, in addition to documentation by the city on official polling numbers.
What principles or methods did you use in this audit?
Well, it's my job, in regards to determining whether or not there was fraud, to see if what I find in the interviews can be corroborated with physical evidence. And from there, I run a series of quantitative regression analyses, which is basically a series of math problems to determine whether or not that would have any impact on the election results.
Is this the standard method of procedure in your field?
It is, absolutely.
And did you reliably apply those methods to your facts and data and come to conclusions?
Yes, of course, as I would in any case.
Well, Dr. Davis, then, could you tell us what your conclusions were concerning that term you used earlier, election fraud?
Absolutely. I found 2 types of election fraud in this particular case: misinformation and voter intimidation. Now, misinformation is the distribution of false or imperfect information about an election.
What evidence of misinformation did you find?
I found this in a series of phone calls and text messages that were sent out to citizens in Bellevue. These text messages and phone calls contained false information about the date of the election, and all reports of these phone calls and text messages came from the same number.
Dr. Davis, you mentioned another term, voter intimidation. What's that?
Well, voter intimidation is the use of threats. These can be economic or legal, for example. And these threats are used to dissuade voters from coming out to an election.
What evidence of voter intimidation did you find?
Again, I found 2 main things. The first was a flyer, which detailed voting requirements that it said Midlands has, which were not in fact true. And something to note that's important about this flyer is that it contained a threat of jail time or a fine if these things were violated. Now, that's a typical scare tactic that we see in these instances of voter intimidation.
Dr. Davis, was District 12 or Bellevue the only place from which reports of this fraud came?
It was, yes, and I actually brought along a chart to help better explain why that was so concerning.
Your Honor, permission at this time for Dr. Davis to step down and make use of her chart. Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Davis, what are we looking at here?
Well, this is a chart, this is a picture of Truman Midlands, and it's divided up into each of the different voting districts, 1 through 12. Now, it also contains the support levels for the Elizabeth Ginger campaign and our last reliable poll leading up to the election. The green districts that you see, that indicates that the district had 0 to 50% Ginger support. Yellow is 51 to 80%, and red is 81 to 100% Ginger support.
You said you were concerned about this. Why was this concerning?
Well, as you can see, there's only one red district here, and that's District 12. Now, District 12 was the only district in which we had reports of fraud, and you can see that that fraud was concentrated in by far the most pro-Ginger district. What's also concerning is that District 12 is demographically distinct from the other districts in Truman. It's by far the most poor and uneducated.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation to this line of questioning.
What specifically are you referring to?
She's testifying as to how this demographic is different from the rest. The foundation that has been laid so far is her knowledge of election law, not demographics.
Your Honor, yes, I believe we established a foundation and introductory questions where Dr. Davis said she was given a number of different documents by the city itself to help her come to conclusions. She said she relied upon those documents in order to come to conclusions, and as an expert in election law and election fraud, she certainly knows how demographic data would influence election fraud and its effects. I certainly believe this is within the scope of a 702 opinion.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Briefly.
Opposing counsel is eliciting facts that are not in evidence. This witness has not testified that her knowledge of election law translates to demographics. That foundation needs to be laid for her to testify to this information.
Overruled. So Dr. Davis, again, could you tell us a little bit about those demographics of District 12 you were just discussing?
Absolutely. Well, as I was saying, District 12 is demographically distinct. It's the most poor and uneducated district in all of Truman. Now, that tends to mean that the people in Truman, in Bellevue specifically, are more likely to be affected by the types of fraud that I just discussed, voter intimidation and misinformation.
So Dr. Davis, once you've looked at the types of fraud, what do you do next in your audit?
Well, our next step is determining whether or not this fraud made a difference.
And how do you do this?
Well, our first step is to look at voter registration levels. Now, you can see here that there was actually a marked increase in voter registration in the 12th district of about 48%.
Dr. Davis, once you look at that change in voter registration, what's the next step?
Well, then we turn to actual voter turnout. Now, typically we expect voter turnout to remain relatively consistent over time and at about projected levels. Now, in this case, that would be about 19.5 or 20%. But that's not actually what happened. What we saw was a 25% decrease in voter turnout in District 12.
Dr. Davis, once you see these two disparities, what do you have to do next?
Well, given that there were the certain types of fraud present and there was this abnormal decrease in voter turnout, I presume that this was due to the election fraud. So the next step is determining if but for this fraud, Elizabeth Ginger would have won the election.
Well, how do you determine this, Dr. Davis?
Well, then we turn back to these support levels that I mentioned earlier. Now, in the last reliable poll, Elizabeth Ginger was polling at about 90% support, and Heisman was in turn at 9% support. So this is where that quantitative analysis comes in. It's a little bit of math, but just stay with me. That means if we're to presume that for each additional vote cast, the votes would have been cast in accordance with these support levels, for each additional vote, Elizabeth Ginger would have gained 0.81 votes.
Could you break that down a little bit more for us, Dr. Davis, and explain the significance of Ms. Ginger gaining 0.81 votes for each additional vote?
Absolutely. Well, Ms. Ginger, she lost the election by 223 votes. So if we're to assume that for each additional vote cast, to bring us back to these traditional and projected voter turnout levels, if she were to gain 0.81 votes, well then 276 additional votes would have been needed to cast to result in a Ginger victory.
So Dr. Davis, looking at all of these numbers, what conclusions did you draw?
Well, we turn to the voter turnout levels at their traditional, their historic, and their projected levels of about 19.5%. Now, we see that that would result in an increase of 355 votes, and in turn, result in a Ginger victory.
Dr. Davis, what then was your conclusion concerning whether or not any election fraud changed the election's outcome?
Well, given both the types of fraud that were present And the fact that it would have resulted in a Ginger victory if voter turnout had been at just 18.5%, which is again below both historic and projected levels, I conclude that the fraud did affect the outcome of the election.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. You can return to your seat. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time. I would ask opposing counsel